Hello and welcome to CET 4884. In this session, we will address the risk associated with a threat or an attack. We will learn the process of identifying a risk and how to manage and control risk. Information security threats are considered a risk that can affect business processes and procedures. Risk is defined as an undesirable situation or circumstance which has both probability of occurring and a potential consequence to companies' processes. Risks are normally associated with uncertainties. The process of identifying and controlling risks facing the organization is called risk management. Risk identification is the formal process of examining, documenting, and recording the current information technology security situation, then justifying and recommending risk controls. So basically, you have to look at the current system that you have in place and see if you need any changes or if there are any threats or any problems, any risks in that system. Risk controls are used to reduce or eliminate risks to an organization information security, and you should have that in the plan. So basically, we are addressing risk first because we need to include that in our plan when we create a plan for information security. We need to select the controls that are suitable or that are effective in eliminating or at least minimizing the risk. So what is the process of doing that? First, we must identify, examine, and understand information systems currently in place. And that's what we need at the beginning to understand the system that we are dealing with. What kind of security issues do they have? What kind of security controls been put in place? And that will be in order to protect the assets. So we define here as the information and the system that use, store, and transmit the information is called the asset. And we have to understand everything about the information that we have in the system. Once we have examined these aspects, we can then look at what we are already doing to protect the information and systems from the threats. And again, we have to identify what kind of controls do we have, what kind of hardware, software. So we look at the system and we identify and understand that system in place. This figure shows risk management processes. In the risk identification, we identify, classify, then prioritize risk. We will see, actually, we can develop some kind of a matrix that will show me the highest risk, the medium risk, and the lowest risk. And in some situations, the low risk can be actually identified as something that it's okay to go with, but it has to be monitored not to go to the high risk or the red area. And then we do risk assessment. So risk identification in the beginning, then we do risk assessment. In the risk assessment process, we assess the risk, identify the consequences, and suggest probable solutions. We need to see what will happen, what are the results if that risk happen. So the management or the report or the planning or whatever we are doing, we need to identify the consequences. We need to identify the impact of that risk on the system. And then we do risk control. In the risk control process, we evaluate risk controls, determine which control options are cost effective for the organization. As we did in the assessment, we said we need to suggest probable solutions. So we identify all alternatives, and then in the risk control process, we can determine which option will be the most effective, whether cost, quality, or in security level then acquire and install those controls or these devices, hardware, software. We can install it to the system. Once controls are in place, the risk management team will monitor these controls, ensuring that the controls remain effective or are working as intended. So even after installing the controls, that does not mean that our work has been done or we're done with evaluating the system or the risk assessment. Actually, we have to keep on monitoring the system to make sure that those controls are working effectively. So in the first process, let's talk more about the risk identification and see how it works. So the organization's risk management strategy will include the identification or identifying, classifying, and prioritizing the organization's information assets. What are the assets? What do we have as assets in the company? Is it the data? Is it the machines? Is it whatever we have? Need to be identified and need to understand if they are targets of various threats. And we need also to identify the threats. What kind of threats would those assets be exposed to? So our goal is to protect those assets from the different threats or different identified threats. Once we have once we go through the process of self-examining, or if we have a third party and comes and examine the system, then we move to threat identification, and we must assess the circumstances and settings of each information asset. So we identify the asset, we identify the threats, and we can also identify the impact of that threat on the asset. What will happen if that threat actually hit the organization? To begin managing the risk from the vulnerabilities, we must identify these vulnerabilities and begin exploring the controls that might be used to manage the risk. We begin the process by identifying and assessing the value of our information assets, identifying the threats, what will be the impact of those threats, and how we can solve the problem, or what are the alternative solutions. And some of the components of risk identification will be the people, the procedure, data, software, and hardware. So we need to look at these components and see where do we have a threat, and how we can fix that. And again, we'll talk about that in details later on, but each component will have some sort of mitigation, some sort of solution that we can implement. Just to give you a hint, for example, for the component of people, if we have a problem with the people, then we do training to minimize vulnerabilities, training to minimize the risk on the assets. So, and we'll talk, like I said, we'll talk more in details in the next few slides and other sessions. Risk identification generates a list of all possible risks that could affect organization assets. The risk manager should create a team representing all affected areas of the organization. So we have a diversity of the teams that we are assigned to, or that we need to assign to the risk management, and a plan will be provided to the management by to update reports, to show them risk reviews, and presentations if needed can be also display for the upper management what are the assets, what are the problems, and what will be the impact. The risk managers will assign tasks and establish a timeline for deliverables. So now we know, since we know, then the managers will say, okay, let's start solving these problems, let's face these risks and vulnerabilities, and we will assign a task for each person or each team, and then we expect some deliverables at the end of these projects of mitigating risk. This figure shows the different steps or activities of a risk identification. And again, this is just for risk identification. So we plan and organize the process. We categorize system components. We check the inventory and categorize assets. We classify and prioritize assets. Then we identify and prioritize threats and specify asset vulnerabilities. The organization will use an iterative process to identify assets, including all the elements of an organization system, procedures, data and information, software, hardware, and networking elements. Then we classify and categorize the assets, adding details as we dig deeper into the analysis and we understand the system more. We know the system more. So with the analysis, we understand the system, and then we would like to categorize which one has the most priority, or which asset is the most vulnerable or valuable for the company, and then I need to start protecting these assets based on their priority. This slide shows an example of information system components categorization. We have human resources, documentation, and data information assets are more difficult to identify. These assets should be identified, described, and evaluated by people using knowledge, experience, and judgment. So not anyone can do that. As these elements are identified, they should also be recorded into some reliable data handling process. Some of the attributes that are required to be recorded are for people, we need to record the position, the name, the number, the ID, roles or functions, supervisor, security clearance level, and special skills. For procedures, we need to add the description of the procedure, the intended purpose of the procedure, what elements it is tied to, storage location for reference, storage location for update. For data, we need to classify the data, who will be the owner of the data, or the creator, or maybe both, owner, creator, and manager. Then we have the data structure, size, data structure used, online, offline, usage, would it be, does it have to be online or it can be offline? Then the location, the backup procedures employed in the system. For software and hardware, the attributes depends on organization, risk management needs, and information security needs. And some of the attributes to be considered are name, IP address, MAC address, element type, serial number, manufacturer name, model or part number, software version, physical or logical location, controlling entity. And for the RFID technology, if we are using RFID technology, that it can be used to track the hardware, so it will be easier when we are using the radio frequency IDs, which is the the replacement of the serial numbers. Now they are using those white stickers on the boxes, like a plastic like a piece on the devices, and this is called RFID. That radio frequency can pass through a reader, and it will read the device and know exactly what kind of information does it have. And then we have the software and network components, and the information, we need to keep their information up to date. There are different data classification schemas that have been developed and used by corporate and military organizations. Information owners are responsible for classifying the information assets for which they are responsible. At least once a year, information owners must review information classifications to ensure the information is still classified correctly and the appropriate access controls are in place. From one year to another, the information might change, the owner might change, the description might change, and for that, it should be classified differently. Once it's classified differently, then the controls may be in place will not be the appropriate ones, so we need to change them to different kind of controls. The US military classification schema has a more complex categorization system than required by most corporations. For most information, the military uses a 5-level classification schema: unclassified, sensitive but unclassified, for official use only, confidential, secret, and top secret. Most organizations do not need to classify their data as done by the military or federal agencies. Organizations should be still classified to be protected from any threats or any identified risks. Um, Being an organization, being a private organization, that doesn't mean that you should not classify your data. You can still classify the data and protect the data as needed. The organization classification could be as simple as like public for official use only, and sensitive and maybe classified. So it depends on what kind of organization, what kind of data you're dealing with, what kind of information, and based on that you can do the classification yourself. The organization need to protect their sensitive and classified data at all times. Once the information being classified, security levels of access to be has to be structured. It can be called personal security clearance structure. Each user within the organization will be assigned a single level of authorization. That level indicates the data that the user is authorized to view. Before individuals are allowed to access a specific set of data, they must meet the need to know requirements. Do they need to know this kind of information? Are they allowed to use this kind of information? This extra level of protection ensures that the confidentiality of information is properly maintained. Requirements for the management of information include the storage, distribution, portability, and destruction of classified information. Even if you're done and you want to get rid of the information, how do you dispose this information or destruct the information after you're done with it? Information that has a classification designation other than unclassified or public must be clearly marked as such and must be destroyed properly or disposed from properly. When classified data is stored, it must be unavailable or to unauthorized individuals. Yes, we store it, but not for everybody to be able to access it and use it. When an individual carries classified information, it should be protected as in a locked briefcase or portfolio. The clean disk policy requires each employee to secure any and all information in its appropriate storage container at the end of each day. When classified information is no longer valuable or excessive copies exist, proper care should be taken to destroy any unneeded copies through shredding, burning, or transferring to an authorized document destructive or destruction service. There are those individuals who would not hesitate to engage in a dumpster diving to retrieve information that could prove embarrassing or compromise the security of information in the organization. Basically, even if you are trying to dispose them just by throw them in the trash, you will see people diving in the trash and getting the information. So you have to destroy it in the proper way, not by throwing it in the trash. Many organizations already have a classification schema or scheme in place. For example, confidential data, internal data, and public data. In addition, they have levels of access for their employees. All organizations should consider having a data classification model and authorization to access the different levels. For example, you can see read only, you can see read and write, or full control. That also another classification for the data to access or to be authorized to use the data. Organizations should provide their employees with the proper training to inform them about data usage, storage, and transforming, what they are allowed to do, what they are not allowed to do. This slide lists some of the questions that could assist the organization in developing the criteria to be used for asset valuation. We can ask which information asset is the most critical to the success of organization, and based on the answer we can define the priority for the information as an asset. Which information asset generates the most revenue? And that is also by answering that answer we know which one is the with the highest revenue and should be protected, because any effect on that asset will affect the revenue of the company. A third question, which information asset generates the most profitability? So with the revenue, profit, which one is the most expensive to replace? Which one is the most expensive to protect? Which one will provide the media or the world with the most embarrassing or cause the greatest liability if revealed? All these questions will lead to the highest value asset, and will give us the priority for protecting our assets and using the proper controls. This slide shows an example of a form or a document that can be used to classify data and assign priorities. In order to finalize this step of the information assets identification process, each organization should create a weighing for each category, like weights for the different categories based on the answer to the previous questions. Which factor is the most important to the organization? Which will, answering that question will give us the most weight. And we'll assign that weight to that asset. Once each question has been weighted, calculating the importance of each asset is straightforward. Just we add all these weights, and the one with the highest weights will be the highest evaluation asset, and we need to protect that asset. The final step is to list those assets in order of importance. This can be achieved by using the weights or the weighted factor analysis worksheet, and that will give us the different priorities. This slide shows an example of weighted factor analysis worksheet, and you can see the weighted scores at the last column, which shows the one with the highest weights and the importance of that asset. In the same way data was classified, threats should be also identified and classified. If we assume every threat can and will attack every information asset, this will quickly become more complex and overwhelm the ability to plan. To make this part of the process manageable, each step in the threat identification and vulnerability identification process is managed separately and then coordinated at the end of the process. This slide shows the threat classification and examples of their attack. So this one, the threat, this is the example for their attack. Then we do the vulnerability identification. Since the organization identified the assets, classified their data, and identified the threats, they need to review data and threats to create list of all possible vulnerabilities in the system. What are the weaknesses of the system and how to protect it? Vulnerabilities are defined as the specific avenues that threat agents can exploit to attack an information asset. So we need to look or find these vulnerabilities and make sure that we are protecting those vulnerabilities from any external attacks. Based on all the previous analysis and documentation, we can determine the relative risk for each of the vulnerabilities through a process called risk assessment. Risk assessment assigns a risk rating or score to each specific information asset, which is useful in gauging the relative risk introduced by each vulnerable information asset and making comparative ratings later in the risk control process. And you can again, you can do iteration and you can redo it. The information will change, the risk will change every time we do that, so we have to do that on periodic, maybe every quarter or every year. The most important thing is to keep identifying those risks and identifying the vulnerabilities or threats and making sure that we have the proper rating for them. The risk rating or score will be associated with numerical probability values between 0.1, which considered low, and 1, which is considered high. Zero values vulnerabilities will be removed from the list. If it has zero, then there are no threats, there are no vulnerabilities, so why to bother? Risk determination. For the purpose of relative risk assessment, we need to record the risk, likelihood of vulnerability occurrence. We need to see the time, value or impact, minus plus percentage risk already controlled, and element of uncertainty. After identifying information threats and associated vulnerabilities, a list of control ideas or controlling ideas will be created to address residual risk. Residual risk is the risk that remains to the information asset even after the existing control has been applied. The most common controls are policies, programs, and of course technologies. Documenting the results of risk assessment, one of the most important steps to the process and the assessment, or that will be a result of the risk assessment. The goal of this process has been to identify the information assets of the organization that have specific vulnerabilities and create a list of them ranked for focus on those most needing protection first. In preparing this list, we have collected and preserved a wealth of factual information about the assets, the threats they face, and the vulnerabilities they experience. We should also have collected some information about the controls that are already in place. And again, even the controls that you have in place, you can evaluate them just to make sure that they are working properly. Every year, it's good to have some kind of evaluation for the controls, for the assets, for other things, so you can either use new controls or maybe update the current controls, or shuffle controls between the different vulnerabilities and risks available. This slide shows an example of ranked vulnerability risk worksheet, and you can see the likelihood and the risk rating factor. All created documents will be delivered or submitted to the upper management for proper decision making. We can even list the deliverables and the purpose of each deliverable, and then again, if there is a presentation or there is something that need to be associated with it, recommendation of the controls, all that will be included in the report, and then whatever need to be implemented should be implemented. So we'll stop at this point, and next slide we will continue with the process of assessing identification and controlling the risk. That will be all for this session. If you have any questions, please let me know. Thank you and have a great day.